Another very important text from the intertestamental period is the book of First Enoch. First Enoch is a strange composition as it stands, insofar as it's really a collection of books, an emerging library, as it were, which shows continuity as it developed. That is to say, the later parts tend to assume information given in the earlier composed parts, suggesting also some continuity among the stream of Judaism within which this kind of material was nurtured. As it stands now, First Enoch is composed of about 5 parts. One of the earliest parts is the Book of the Watchers, the first 36 chapters, although it's thought that the first 5 chapters might have been added on as a prologue to that. Another very early part would be the astronomical book, which itself is a digest of a probably much longer text about the movement of the moon and the sun for the calculation of the solar year, which was a distinctive feature of this literature and certain sects within early Judaism, notably the Qumran community and the Essene movement, which believed that the annual festivals and Sabbaths and what have you ought to be calculated in terms of the solar year and not the lunar year. This became a major bone of contention between the Essenes, particularly the Qumran community, and the Jewish priests in charge of the Jerusalem temple, who switched from a solar to a lunar calendar when the Seleucid kingdom with Antiochus III wrested the territory of Judea from Egypt, from Ptolemy's control. The Seleucid Empire followed a lunar calendar, and the Jerusalem temple personnel appear to have adapted to that calendar. The dream visions is another earlier part of First Enoch, probably later than the astronomical book and the Book of the Watchers, but still pre-Maccabean in its composition. That is to say, before, well, not entirely pre-Maccabean, but before the end of the Maccabean revolution, because Judas Maccabeus is featured prominently in an allegory within this section known as the animal apocalypse, but then not much after him is narrated. So it was likely composed even during his lifetime and not much later. The 5th portion of the present book, the Admonition of Enoch, would have been written during the Hasmonean period for the most part, except for a very short passage, now divided between 2 chapters, known as the Apocalypse of Weeks, which also might come from the earlier Maccabean or pre-Maccabean period. The latest layer of First Enoch is the Parables of Enoch, which is currently the 2nd largest block of text, First Enoch 37 to 71. In all likelihood, this section comes from early Herodian times, so still before the turn of the era, but not by much. This collection, as such, or large parts of it, were represented among the finds among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Several different manuscripts of First Enoch, 5 at the very least, were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The text was clearly regarded as authoritative there, which is not surprising since the Qumran community, like the Essenes as a whole, followed the solar calendar, and First Enoch was an early text promoting and in fact laying out the proper calculation of this calendar. First Enoch also circulated outside of Palestine in a Greek translation and it's in fact on the Greek version that most of our modern translations depend the most, because the Hebrew finds that Qumran were so fragmentary. Something like maybe 20% of First Enoch is represented in any way in Hebrew, but the Greek witness is much more complete. Why should Enoch become the center for such literary production, and especially of this sort? First Enoch is an apocalypse, or I should say a collection of apocalypses. It's very interested in the four things that seem to characterize most apocalyptic works. What happened before recorded history? What will happen after history has run its course to bring it to its end? What goes on in the heavenly spheres? And what goes on in the infernal spheres? Not to mention other regions of the cosmos to which humans do not have ordinary access. Why should Enoch become the spokesperson for such revelations, as it were, of protology and eschatology and cosmology? Enoch, we know very little about the Enoch of history, but from Genesis 5, we're told that he lived 365 years, and that he walked with God, and then suddenly disappeared. He was seen no more because God took him. As this story is remembered by Ben Sira, about 200 years before Christ, few have ever been created on earth like Enoch, for he was taken up from the earth. Walking with God, or walking with the angels, the Elohim, suggests that Enoch was privy to seeing far more than the typical mortal was able to see. The idea that God took him, that he walked with God, was extended beyond simply his disappearance from the mortal sphere to a description of more interactions that he had, journeying with God, journeying with angels, and therefore being privy to seeing what happens behind the scenes of this present visible creation. And also then, because he was taken up when he was 365 years old, which is a number, as a number, it's one day more than a solar year of 364 days, Enoch became symbolic of the solar year, the solar calendar, as opposed to the lunar year, which is more like 330 days. I'm not exactly sure, with the result that, 354 days, that's it, with the result that an extra month has to be added every 3 years to reconcile the calendar with the actual movements of the seasons and what have you. So these two textual connections appear to have made Enoch a lightning rod for astronomical observations in support of a solar year and apocalyptic material. The story that First Enoch tells, especially in chapters 6 through 36, exercised quite an influence on other Jewish literature. The same story appears in Jubilees, a 2nd century BC paraphrase of Genesis 1 through Exodus 14, a paraphrase, moreover, that was also regarded as an authoritative text at the Qumran community, and therefore presumably among Essenes at large. It also has left its mark on the testaments of the 12 patriarchs, which frequently refers to what is written in the book or books of Enoch. Ben Sira 16:7 also shows evidence of knowledge of the story of the watchers, the fallen angels, that First Enoch tells. And of course the manuscript discoveries among the Dead Sea Scrolls bear witness to its influence there among the Qumran community which is still regarded by many to have been more or less the pace-setter community for the Essene movement. The Book of the Watchers is probably the most important single section of 1st Enoch. It is believed to have been written prior to 200 BC and shows an interesting attraction to the story in Genesis 6, 1 through 4 as a place to go for the explanation of the source of evil in the world. Most Christians, beginning with Paul, naturally gravitate to the story of Genesis 3, what we call the fall narrative, to look for the ways sin entered the world and brought misery to the human scene. But not all Jews looked to that story, and 1st Enoch is remarkable for having set the trend for looking more to Genesis 6, the first few verses there. That short and enigmatic paragraph tells of angels, the sons of God, who looked upon the daughters of human beings, and seeing that they were beautiful, desired to possess them. And so they left heaven and mated with human females, producing a race of giants, which Genesis celebrates as the great people of old, the great people of renown. In the vastly expanded version in 1st Enoch, these watchers, these angels, band together in a pact to fulfill their desire to go AWOL, as it were, and mate with human females and take up residence down there. They bind themselves in a pact because their leader, Azazel, doesn't want to be stuck bearing the brunt of the Almighty's wrath for what they've done. Now, with them, they bring the knowledge of all manner of science and art that would later become detrimental to the human race. Thus, they bring the knowledge of how to mine metals from the earth, giving people the ability to fashion weapons with which to kill one another. They teach women the art of beautifying themselves, the arts of cosmetics, so as to inflame lust. They teach people how to find precious metals and gems, and thus introduce greed, covetousness, into human society. And many other such arts or fields of learning that prove to harm human community rather than enhance it. Moreover, their offspring, the giants, are not now seen as the great people of yesteryear, the larger-than-life figures of a mythical past, but as ravenous brutes who devour all that humans toil after, and eventually prey upon humanity itself to satisfy their appetites. In this story, God intervenes. We don't read about this in Genesis at all, but God now intervenes and imprisons the angels who transgressed their proper bounds in deep pits, chaining them and covering them with rocks so that the light of heaven might not shine upon them anymore. And God strikes their giant offspring dead, which solves some problems but creates others, because the souls of these dead giants continue to live on, becoming the demons that would forever distress humankind. In a way, the story of the giants, the angels mating with humans, and what the giants do, seems to be a reflection of the author's view of the Hellenistic period. That is to say, Judea found itself, almost literally, stuck between giants, the Seleucid kingdom to the north and the Ptolemaic kingdom to the south, who ravaged the land and consumed all the toil of the people between their required tribute and taxes when things were going smoothly, and then their campaigns against one another, which inevitably happened throughout the land of Judea and Palestine as a whole. And of course, when armies move, and especially when they move and do battle, they end up laying waste to great stretches of countryside and city alike. It seems that the author of this portion of this story also wrote with a view to undermining the ideology of the Hellenistic kings, who presented themselves, both north and south, as the children of gods. But really, in this alternative myth, they become symbolic of, or I should say, the offspring of fallen angels are really what are symbolic of Hellenistic monarchs. So they're not sons of gods. They are the brute, violent offspring of fallen angels, as it were. Even while the author shows such reserve, to put it mildly, in his assessment of Hellenistic kingdoms and their influence, it's clear that he's also been influenced by Hellenism. Nothing so closely resembles his story of the angels and the giants as the Greek legends of the Titans coming down to humankind. And of course, Greek gods mating with human females. But the imprisonment of the Titans, many of whom are themselves chained in the earth or otherwise punished, like Atlas, condemned to bear the world on his shoulders, or Prometheus chained to a mountainous crag, for having brought forbidden knowledge to human beings, seems to have exercised some influence on the retelling of Genesis 6 and 1st Enoch. Of course, the flood then becomes a precedent in this story, just as the flood was sent by God to clean up all the garbage, the pollution that had come into God's creation as a result of the teaching activity of the angels and their lustful activity and the activity of their offspring. So the author of 1st Enoch looks ahead to a time when God will intervene again to clean up creation and make it the way it ought to have been, cleaning up the influences and the impact of first Alexander and then all of his successors, his warring successors. 1st Enoch 1 through 36 begins with a vision of judgment, when God comes with 10,000 holy ones to execute judgment upon people and to destroy the impious and to contend with all flesh concerning everything which the sinners and the impious have done and wrought against him. This vision is followed by a reflection on how beautiful and well ordered God's cosmos is, how everything from the stars in heaven to the seasons to the activity of trees throughout the year, through a season, behaves according to God's order, the natural laws that God put in place. Only human beings subvert God's order. They're the one part of creation that fails to move in step with the order that God set for them. Here, clearly having in mind transgression of the Torah, ignored by Gentiles, but also transgressed by the one people that received the Torah specially. And because of this, humanity is most deserving of this coming judgment. This is now the prologue to the story of the Watchers, which, as I've already related, is the birth of every evil that has beset and ensnared humankind. And that is told at length in these 11 chapters. Many of the chapters are quite short, so it's not like chapters of biblical length, in which Enoch portrays, fulfills the role of a kind of messenger of God, visiting the watchers in their subterranean prison and announcing the doom of their half-breed offspring and the like. And after this, Enoch is given an extended journey of those parts of the cosmos that are beyond typical human access. And so he journeys to see the places of punishment for the wicked and the places of reward for the righteous who will walk in line with God's order, with God's Torah, and the places for the punishment of the fallen angels, the stars who transgressed their boundaries. It's particularly that portion of the story that interests Jude. And here we should not be surprised that Jude, especially if he is, the Lord's half-brother, a Judean growing up in the first half of the first century of the Common Era, we shouldn't be surprised that Jude would know this story, because it had well entered the culture, as seen from its inclusion in Ben Sira or Jubilees, texts written during the intertestamental period, that this has become a kind of midrash on Genesis 6, 1 through 4. But even the text itself was well regarded by many in Judea, and even revered as authoritative by one of the major Jewish parties in the period, namely the Essenes. Thus, it shouldn't surprise us that when Jude looks for examples of God's ability to and commitment to punish transgression, he would regard the fallen angels as one such example to put forward, assuming that his readers also would be familiar with the story, since he doesn't develop it at length and even just make some passing allusions to it. So in 1 Enoch we read the punishment of the angels: "Bind Azazel by his hands and his feet and throw him into the darkness. Bind them," now all the angels who have fallen, "for 70 generations underneath the rocks of the ground until the day of their judgment." And then later on Enoch's tour, he sees a barren and bleak and fiery place, and the angel guiding him announces, "This place is the prison of the angels, and there they will be held forever." And so Jude refers to this story: "The angels who do not keep their position, but left their proper dwelling, God has kept in eternal chains in deepest darkness for the judgment of the great day." Now, Jude would know about the angels who didn't keep their position from Genesis 6, but the rest of the story is developed not in Genesis, but primarily in 1 Enoch. When Jude talks about the rival teachers whose intrusion into the communities that he cares about is the major reason for his writing his short warning, he writes, "They are waterless clouds carried along by winds, fruitless trees in late autumn, twice dead, uprooted, wandering stars for whom the nether gloom of darkness has been reserved forever." He is comparing these rival teachers to the fallen angels, and referring again to the story in 1 Enoch. Now, many also hear an echo with 1 Enoch 80, where we read, "The rain will be withheld and heaven will retain it, and in those times the fruits of the earth will be late and will not grow at their proper time, and the fruits of the trees will be withheld at their proper time, and many leaders of the stars in command will go astray, and these will change their courses and not appear at the times which have been prescribed for them." It's perfectly possible that all of these images have been taken up by Jude, waterless clouds, clouds without rain, trees without fruit, as well as then the planets, the planetae, the wandering stars that don't stay put in the sky, to describe the false teachers. But mainly and indisputably, he is referring at least to that latter group, because the fallen angels are also referred to in 1st Enoch as stars, and also spoken of now as being condemned to a prison and being bound there. So the wandering stars, for whom the deepest darkness has been reserved forever in Jude, recalls this is the prison house for the stars and the powers of heaven, the way the angel refers to the place of punishment for the angels slightly earlier in Enoch's vision, his tour of otherworldly places. And then later, these are among the stars of heaven which have transgressed the commandments of the Lord and are bound in this place until the completion of 10,000 ages. So again, these wandering stars, these fallen angels, become a kind of prototype for the false teachers that Jude opposes, people who have themselves transgressed the boundaries that God has set for humanity. And of course, Jude actually quotes a verse from 1st Enoch in the 14th and 15th verses of his letter. He writes, Enoch, the seventh from Adam, proclaimed God's message even to these, saying, Look, the Lord came with tens of thousands of his holy ones, to execute judgment against all and to convict every soul concerning all their ungodly deeds, through which they have lived in an ungodly manner, and concerning all the harsh things which ungodly sinners spoke against him. Now the wording isn't exact with the manuscripts of 1st Enoch that we have, which accords well with the oral culture in which Jude lived, and the freedom that Jude would have felt to reproduce the essence of the text as his memory would allow. One of the interesting things about this quotation is that he has changed everything to the past tense. The Lord came. Perhaps, indeed, looking back on 1st Enoch 1 then, as an announcement not of the last judgment, but of the judgment in the flood, the world judgment that would follow after Enoch's own lifetime, to which Enoch himself gave witness. And then again, this flood remains a prototype, even in Jude, proof of God's commitment to judge and therefore to continue to exercise judgment against all who fail to live in line with God's order, as these rival teachers had done. Jude, though a very short letter, gives us a fine window into how a much longer Jewish text could be used in exhortation within a Jewish movement, here the early Christian church, and maybe another window into the reading, the cultural literacy of Jesus and his family, and certainly the early Christian movement, encouraging us to continue to familiarize ourselves not just with the obvious texts, such as the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, if we want to know what resources the early Christian leaders had at their disposal to nurture this new movement, but also the many texts now collected as apocrypha or pseudepigrapha from the period.